The only word I can say after that is chaos. That was an unbelievable stop-start race which had 3 standing starts and so many twists and turns. I don't even know where to start here, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Saudi Arabia Grand Prix. Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. Verstappen's potentially critical mistake. For one of the first times this year, Verstappen has made a mistake. The Dutch driver has been unbelievable all season and pretty faultless in terms of his race and qualifying performances, and over the course of the weekend in Jeddah it quickly became apparent that the grid position was going to become crucial, and through the practice sessions it was anyone's guess as to whether Red Bull or the Mercedes car would be the fastest once we got into those final Q3 runs. And once they arrived, it was an interesting difference. The Mercedes team tended to need more time to get the tyres warmed up, and as such there was a different approach to those Q3 runs, with Hamilton tending to stay out longer and ran his final quick lap away before the end of the session, with Verstappen instead looking to be on his final lap at the final moment, when the track would be in the best possible condition for that Red Bull car. And once it began, it was one of the most incredible laps I've seen, with the first 2 sectors going purple and with an estimated 3/10 up on Hamilton's pole position time at the Saudi Arabia track. But at the last turn, Verstappen made a mistake, and relatively speaking it was a tiny error, with the front left locking up into that left-hand hairpin. But as a result, Verstappen jumped on the accelerator pedal a little bit too early, which led to the rear end stepping out and hitting the barrier. It was a mistake that cost him the pole position at a circuit where the grid box is so critical. This season has been so consistent for Verstappen. Other than the controversial crashes with Hamilton, which I've covered elsewhere, I can't recall any significant errors that Verstappen has made this season. You could see how much it meant by the reaction of Jos Verstappen in the pit garage as he slammed the desk in a Toto Wolff-esque fit of rage. It was an error that could have easily left him down the order with a gearbox penalty, but he was lucky that the shunt at the rear end didn't send the drive shaft into the gearbox. In the end, it was definitely a mistake, but given the chaos in this race where it was so confusing to watch and the multiple moves into turn 1, I think it was an incident that Verstappen probably got away with from qualifying. So for that qualifying mistake, I think it's an amber box, as that alone didn't leave him out of it, but it was a critical mistake. But before I get into looking at those red flag events, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who's already subscribed to Behind the Drive over the last few weeks. If you haven't done so already, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button. Thanks. The red flag rules. Next up we need to talk about the first red flag incident. And firstly, I need to say I'm really thankful that Mick Schumacher is okay following that heavy shunt into the left-right complex of turns 22 and 23. It didn't even look like he made much of an error, as his Haas car's rear end stepped out on him and he went flying into the Tech Pro barrier. It didn't look like an error, but it definitely seemed like another incident where that Haas car is a handful to drive. I'm sure both Schumacher and Mazepin will be looking forward to seeing the back of that car following the race in Abu Dhabi next weekend. But when we think about the initial safety car period, it was Valtteri Bottas who was breaking the rules as he backed off heavily to ensure he had enough of a gap to Hamilton to allow the Mercedes team to double stack. It was also backing Verstappen into the pack, which would have left him more vulnerable to the cars behind. Now of course Bottas did indeed pit and come out ahead of the rest of the pack, but either way it was not exactly appropriate behaviour from the Finnish driver, and it was indeed a breach of the regs. But then the red flag came out, and this is completely understandable. The Tech Pro barrier was reportedly punctured, and to fix that, the crane is needed on the circuit. I don't think anyone's complaining about the safety element here. The FIA tends to use more red flag periods these days, and I think that's exactly what's needed. There have been lessons learned from mistakes in the past, particularly Suzuka 2014 springs to mind, where there were tractor cranes on the track. But the question is over the rulebook, and whether the cars that should be allowed to change their tyres under those conditions. Of course, Hamilton benefited from the red flags at Silverstone and Imola earlier this season, so what goes around comes around, but that decision could have easily become a crucial one in the ebbs and flows of this championship. What unfolded next though was truly a bizarre situation, so bizarre in fact that it's going to have its own box later on in the video. So for that first red flag period, I think it's got to be a green box. It was the right decision from the FIA, and yes, I think there should be more of a consideration of what can be changed under those red flag conditions in the future. But nobody broke the rules, and it was the sensible decision from the FIA. A unique new circuit. I can't not give a box this week to the new Jeddah Corniche circuit, a track which has been created in about 8 or 9 months since it was announced that the race would be happening in April. And this is a thrilling track, with it being the fastest street circuit ever with a whopping 27 corners. The track itself offers the perfect challenge for the drivers as they thread the needle around a circuit where the walls are never far away. It made for an absolute spectacle in qualifying, where the pace was ramping up so quickly through the session, and the drivers had to find the perfect balance of maximising the track but also not damaging the car. And we saw that in Verstappen's final attempt, a lap which had me on the edge of my seat as he continued to set the quickest time of the weekend, but it all came to an abrupt end at the final turn as the Dutchman locked up into that final hairpin before getting on the gas a bit too early and ended up tagging the barrier. So the circuit offered some of the most exciting qualifying laps ever, but the races in Formula 2 and some of the hair-raising moments we saw in the F1 sessions leading up to the race were certainly something to worry about. The blind nature of the corners meant that whenever one car was on a flying lap and another was on a cool-down or a warm-up lap, there were some terrifying moments. It's something that the teams will all need to learn from going into the next time Formula 1 is hosted at this track in March next year. And that's really not what you want to see in any racing session. The incident between Hamilton and Mazepin was particularly scary and something that could have led to a horrendous accident. And this shows just how this track puts the drivers right on the knife edge and in a position where even a small error could leave them in the barrier and out of the race. Overall, for me, it's a green box for this new track in Saudi Arabia. I think those qualifying laps were so exciting to watch, and watching these drivers compete on the edge for 50 laps is exactly what we want to see. It seems like the drivers love it, and I think it's produced one of the most exciting races of the year. I can't wait to return in March. Masi out of its depth. Next up is a red box for the FIA deals that were discussed and agreed during the second red flag period, and the seeming lack of control that Michael Masi had over this race. And for me, to hear Michael Masi on the radio to the Red Bull pit wall offering them a deal to not refer an incident to the stewards was an interesting one to say the least. Mind you, I'm not sure what would have happened had the incident been referred to the stewards given it was happening during a red flag period. The incident in question was of course that first restart of the grid, where Verstappen led from Hamilton and Bottas. Hamilton got a great launch and was well ahead once they arrived into the first corner, but Verstappen took the position back, bumping his way across the curb in the process and basically putting his Red Bull car in front of the Mercedes. In the process, Ocon innocently worked his way through into P2. Realistically, it was a slam dunk penalty, as Verstappen made the pass well off the circuit and didn't make that corner. But Michael Masi decided to jump on the radio, offering a deal to essentially reverse those positions, putting Verstappen back behind Hamilton in third. It was a confusing situation, not helped by the fact that Michael Masi forgot that Ocon was in P2 and offered the Red Bull pit wall a second place start at one point. In the end, at that restart, Verstappen made a great move down into turn 1, but I don't understand why there was a decision offered to the Red Bull pit wall. But that wasn't even the worst decision from the FIA and Michael Masi. The next point that unfolded was a virtual safety car restart where once again Hamilton got alongside Verstappen on the outside, and the Dutchman subsequently ended up off the track to keep his position, for which he was penalised. But in the confusion, there was a call from Red Bull to let Hamilton by, something that Verstappen later tried to do, but that same message hadn't even got to the Mercedes driver, so when Verstappen slowed down on the straight to try and let Hamilton go by, despite the fact that there were no yellow flags, Hamilton didn't go past. It didn't help that it was a narrow part of the track, but there was a moment where, going slowly, Verstappen moved his car to the left into the middle of the track, which just looked like he didn't try and leave any door open. It begs the question of why Hamilton didn't just blast past on the straight, but given he hadn't been told, it's fair to assume he was probably thinking there was a yellow flag or yet another virtual safety car. But even so, he should have just gone for it and gone past on the track. That moment of course resulted in the contact between the two, which left Hamilton without a front wing end plate, and after the contact Verstappen darted off back along the straight. It was just utter confusion on the grid, and if this was your first time watching an F1 Grand Prix, you'll probably have been left massively confused with how this sport is policed. There were then two more incidents where Verstappen handed the place back, the first of these being just before the DRS detection point, where the Dutchman took the position back immediately, and the second when he let Hamilton go before the Mercedes darted off into the distance, given he had a significant tyre advantage. Ultimately, I'm massively confused with the fact that Verstappen handed the lead back and got a 5-second time penalty. It's seriously confusing, and I think this one's going to develop over the next few days as we head towards the final round in Abu Dhabi. Mercedes takes control of the Constructors' Championship. And finally, I want to give a green box to the Mercedes team. Not only did they make a good call with the hard tyres, ensuring Hamilton had the pace at the end of the race, but they also had Valtteri Bottas in place who made some great moves to take P3 right on the finish line. It was a massively impressive performance from the Mercedes team in a race that had so much back and forth and stops and starts. It was a hugely significant race, and after what was fundamentally a lucky result in qualifying with Verstappen not taking pole position, they absolutely made the most of it this evening in Saudi Arabia. Mercedes have also produced a car which has been able to withstand a number of incidents today. His contact with Ocon, that contact with Verstappen, and despite the front wing end plate loss, he was still able to set fastest laps on tyres that were almost 40 laps old. Meanwhile, the fact that Perez failed to finish meant it was an impressive haul of points from Mercedes over Red Bull, and that wasn't really anyone's fault after Perez was tagged by Charles Leclerc at the start of the first restart. It meant that the Mercedes team have a 28-point lead in the Constructors' Championship going into the final round in Abu Dhabi, and with things the way they are now, it has to be said that it's a pretty commanding lead with one race left. I've basically only talked about Red Bull and Mercedes today, and this race in general, but you of course have a few drivers who benefited massively from the red flags, including Esteban Ocon, who just missed out on the podium at the finish line to Bottas, Ricciardo, who fought valiantly against Bottas throughout the race, and then Pierre Gasly, who took 6th as well. Overall though, it was a chaotic race, and one that really wasn't an amazing advert of Formula 1 racing. There were so many events through that race that even the pundits didn't know where to start. We go into the final race next week with the two title protagonists level on points, with Verstappen only ahead based on his single extra victory. Who knows what's going to happen, but in the meantime, let me know in the comments what you thought of this race and who's going to win the title.